I'm Angie Muhs with PressHerald.com. Today we have visiting us Dave Epstein, who does the Maine Forecast blog for PressHerald.com. Dave is a meteorologist and a horticulturalist who has another site, GrowingWisdom.com. Thanks for coming by, Dave, to talk.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, we were going to talk today about some of the things we'll be seeing with the Maine Forecast, weather trends in the next few weeks and further out. Tell me a little bit about, we're just past Columbus Day, the foliage. What's still out there? Why have we had such a great year?
Yeah, it has been an amazing year for sure. One of the reasons it's been so good is because we had even amounts of precipitation through the summer. So June was fairly wet, but then it rained regularly. We also didn't have a ton of wind or big rainstorms in the early part of the fall, so that can strip the leaves from the trees. And the other thing is that the trees are just generally healthy, so that as they're beginning to go into their winter dormancy period, the color's just coming on strong. So this is a really good year, a lot of vibrant colors. Coastal Plain is the place to be now that we're past Columbus Day. Peak has continuing to move off towards the south. So interior places of Cumberland, York, Oxford County, still some great color, but the real peak color this upcoming weekend and beyond will be along the coastline and then heading into southern New England.
Mm-hmm. Now, you're a Maine native. Do you have any secret spots you can suggest that people ought to check out?
Well, personally, I really like some of the coastal areas. So if you're driving up through Brunswick and Bath and that area and you get just inland a little bit, I think some of the maples look fantastic. I also like the Bridgeton area because I spent many summers in Bridgeton at Camp Kingswood up there. So anywhere around the Lakes region is also terrific.
Okay. Now, of course, as we're winding out a foliage season, we've got the frost looming. We haven't really had that yet, but when do you think we're going to start seeing a turn towards the cold?
So we're past the average date of a frost in Portland. So if you look at, say, 100 years, we normally would have had at least one frost even in the city at this point, but we haven't. And as a matter of fact, this entire week looks fairly mild. So it's not until we get to the end of the week and perhaps into next week where we really start to see perhaps a little bit of colder air. But we could make it through most of October in some places without a hard killing freeze. And that would be pretty amazing. So if you still have things in the garden, and if you planted some of the mums and some of the other fall flowers, they're going to do great, especially over Coastal Plain, where it's been much milder than you typically expect.
Yeah, and you just mentioned garden. Put on your other hat for a minute.
Sure.
What should people be doing? Is there anything still going on out there for most people?
Yeah, so there's a group of crops. They're mostly the brassicas, which love to grow in the colder weather. So things like kale. If you still have broccoli in the garden, you can be eating the leaves, even though you might not be getting broccoli. The other thing that's going to come up pretty good here are the collards. We also have Brussels sprouts, and all of those benefit from a little bit of cold. So they like that first frost, and the leaves tend to sweeten up a little bit. So many folks think that once you get into early October, you kind of clear the garden out. I tend to plant stuff back in early September that I'll harvest later in October and even into November. If you do get a frost, cover it with a sheet or something called row cover, and that can protect crops down to 28 degrees.
Interesting. Now, speaking of the cold, the Old Farmer's Almanac, the Farmer's Almanac, both of them are not very cheerful about what they're saying about the winter. And before we went on air, we were talking about last season's huge blizzard and the other storms. What do you think? How bad is this winter going to be?
Well, last winter really didn't get going until we got into the winter, and then of course we had a very snowy late January. February was incredible in the beginning of March. This year, early indications are that we'll have more of a typical winter, so I don't think we're going to be up close to that 100-inch mark like we were in the city of Portland last year. Maybe we're down into the 50s or low 60s in terms of total snowfall. It does look like more of a typical winter. Farmer's Almanac, those are great publications to read and kind of enjoy, but when you look at the science behind those as opposed to the science behind sort of maybe what I'm looking at, they're totally different camps, and I think you just want to think of them a little bit differently. What we look for are more of the shorter range patterns, what's going on in the Atlantic, what's going on in the Arctic. Those things really help to give us an indication for what the winter will look like.
Mm-hmm. And how reliable are these long-range forecasts? I mean, either way.
Sure. Well, the reliability of a long-range forecast is pretty good with things like it's going to be cold, it's going to be wet. But to know that on January 15th it's going to be sunny or snowy, there's no reliability at that point. what we will tend to look for are, again, what's going on with some of the shorter term and medium term patterns, especially in the Atlantic. That's a very important thing that we'll be watching. There's something called the North Atlantic Oscillation. When that tends to go negative, we tend to be snowier and colder. So we'll be watching that. And that's fairly reliable out to about 2 weeks. So that's why we can kind of get an indication that things are going to change for warmer or cooler weather.
And on one final note, speaking about, there was a New York Times article this week about climate trends we may be seeing, 50 years from now.
Sure.
You had a post recently in your blog about climate change. Tell the viewers a little bit about what you had to say in case they missed that post.
So the IPCC, which is the UN organization which comes out with these climate sort of predictions about every 7 years, came out with their latest prediction about a week ago. And what that does is it takes a lot of scientific information and aggregates it and says, okay, based on what we know right now, here's where we think climate's going to be in the future. That is still a prediction. It's based on models similar to our short-range forecast.
Yeah.
And just like our short-range forecast can have problems, so can those long-range. So what you tend to see are ranges. So you'll see, we could be this warm or we could be this warm. And that range is quite large.
Yeah.
So it really does depend on exactly sort of how things trend over the next several decades to where we end up in the range. My big mantra with everyone is to really read that, but think critically about it and know that it can change and know that those are predictions. That yes, man has an impact on climate, but what that impact is still a big question, and how it ends up looking in 2076 or 2100 or beyond. I think we're still going to see many changes ahead.
Okay. Well, thanks again for coming by, Dave. You can follow Dave's blog on pressherald.com. It's called the Maine Forecast. You can follow him on Twitter @GrowingWisdom. And thanks for coming by.
Thank you very much.